So I mean, I like to believe in my heart that people can make a difference and people can make a change, and so that the protests were a huge factor of all this. Do you think that that had an effect, or was it basically just what Evan said, and that was, the governments had just too much leverage here, and that's why they backed out?
It's both.
Yeah.
Uh, it's both. If so, what the protest did was not that they actually had any impact on the club's decision making. I would say I think it's very like the clubs had to have baked in a protest into this
Yeah.
decision. I simply don't believe that you could have done this without assuming there would be outcry. So they must have baked that in, but they understood, right, that they were in a position that was incredibly powerful vis-a-vis the existing footballing structures. However, one thing that political protest does is it moves politicians. So when you saw these people lining up and vigorously and vociferously and angrily protesting this, the clubs weren't moved, but like the MPs were moved and the politicians in various countries were moved. So, and that led directly to them involving themselves, I think.
And it's just the easiest thing in the world to see how someone like Boris Johnson, this is right in his wheelhouse, right? Protect European soccer, in a post-Brexit age, right? When it's all about, global England and everything else, right? He wants the EPL to be the premier global league, right? He doesn't want his best English teams in this continental thing. He can make this case as kind of an English nationalist or British nationalist about the importance of, keeping these British clubs British. It's not a hard leap for him. And that's why the astounding thing, like it blows my mind, is the failure to get political stakeholders on board before you launch this thing. What are you thinking? Like, Ed Woodward can get the prime minister's office on the phone if he needs to.
Right.
No doubt about this. Right? You can get these people on the phone. You can know what their position is ahead of time. Maybe, I guess it's possible they floated this and then the politicians kind of turned on them. I think that, I don't know, that doesn't feel like what happened to me. It feels like they just didn't get their ducks in a row and they rushed this out.
And that's it's just shocking to me. It's unbelievable to me when you have all these businessmen who billionaires who didn't figure that part out of it. It's unbelievable. And again, I just look, I'm far from reaching that kind of financial level, so I don't even can't even begin to know how they think. But that part really shocked me. So you guys bring up interesting points about the legal implications and how that would affect European kind of football more so than it would in like an NBA association, which are kind of under the umbrella of one country, well, two countries really. So it's a little bit easier. But when you have Boris Johnson affecting what happens in England and different countries have different legislations, that's going to make it difficult. One thing that I found interesting yesterday when I was finding more information about the basketball Super League is that the European Basketball Super League is kind of like this. In, I believe it was the 90s or the 80s, I can't remember which decade it was, but 11 basketball teams in Europe, including Real Madrid and Barcelona, branched out and formed a super league of 11 teams that could not get relegated from this league. And the rest of the teams just kind of rotate based on merit. So that structure exists in basketball. At the time, there was opposition to it, and now it's successful and people like it. I think I would assume that the reason why that works and this doesn't is because there's just too much, like football is just so much bigger in Europe that there was just more outcry over it is what I would guess. Um, but I was
Yes.
curious, I guess, to know if you guys had any thoughts on that in particular.
I There is one other element and to this, I think, and Evan knows the law a little, I think, better than I do, but one of the reasons that the American sports closed sports league work is that they are granted under the American law a exemption from the antitrust statutes. So if you, I mean, all of these countries have competition laws and laws that protect fair competition and prevent monopolies and cartels from forming. And I mean, I'm sure in England that they at least could have credibly threatened a very intense lawsuit against the English clubs on those grounds.
Yeah, so definitely there's competition law differences, and I'm not an expert in EU competition law, as I've been emphasizing to everyone I talk to about this, that I sort of could just guess what the claims might be under EU competition law. I think a big difference, and I actually don't know much about the history of how like European basketball developed, but I often think about the history of like the legal development of sports in the US and Europe are very different in that in Europe it was very bottom up, right? So you had local clubs that are a lot of times associated with, they were literally athletic clubs, right? Or they were associated with a factory or a union or whatever. And then they built up, created leagues, and over time built into what we have today. The US, the process was a lot more top down from the very start, where you had professional franchises created as professional franchises in a lot of places, in a lot of cities, with the intention of creating the leagues that we know right now. And I think that plays into this a lot of different ways. It makes it feel very different. Like it makes it feel more natural to have a closed system in the US than it does with soccer in Europe, where people feel like it betrays that bottom up pass. And it might explain the difference between European soccer and European basketball, to the extent that there might also be a more top down history for basketball than there is for football.
So, Gabe, I know that I think you've been a Real Madrid fan about it. I think we became Real Madrid fans around the same time. And you and I lived through the Luis Figo thing, where Florentino gets Figo to sign that contract, and Figo's like, well, you're not going to win the election, so I'll probably get the money you promised me if you don't win the election. Then he wins the election. He tells the socios, if you elect me, I'll sign Figo. And then if I don't sign Figo, I'll pay all your membership fees. So that's how he gets elected. He like just hoodwinks all of these different parties. And then Figo signs, and it's still unbelievable over 20 years later. And I mentioned this on Twitter, and I think like, to me, before I kind of knew too much about it, and I'm still not sure like where the truth is really, and I'm curious to ask you guys about this. Was there something similar he did, because he went on El Chiringuito and said none of these teams can leave this thing? And turns out he was wrong about that. Or maybe he believed that that was the truth, in the sense that if they left, there would be too many financial repercussions for them. And that's how they're signed into this thing. And now I'm kind of reading this report from The Guardian about JP Morgan, who is, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, the bank that was funding this Super League if it went ahead.
Yep.
So do you think he was referring to that? So that basically, if they backed out, they weren't getting the funding from them? Because it's not like the clubs would probably owe him or Real Madrid money in this scenario if they get punished. It's just basically they just don't get the funds, right?
Right. So it's a good question. I don't know. I also tend to think that interview is insane. I don't really understand why he did it. He said a bunch of shit that just was factually untrue and disproven essentially instantly. Yeah. I think there were, like, my recollection from reading the soccer league or football leagues documentation about this, and from some of the reporting we've seen, is that yes, there was a kind of penalty exit, but it only kicked in when the Super League had its official like first match or whatever. And so he probably, I mean, like, it's a very common thing if you're trying to create a structure like this to include penalties to prevent people from leaving, because you can't, like, it undermines the entire edifice, which, as we saw, is what happened. But I don't think it would have kicked in yet. And also, so I think it's possible what he was saying was that this is just so much money. All these teams are losing money, which is true. They all lost a lot of money over the last few years. And they need this. And you saw Manchester United is a company that's listed on the American Stock Exchange. So the day that they announced the Super League, United stock jumped because of the amount of money that was going to be invested. And then when they exited the Super League, when it fell apart, the stock dived. So basically, you can see in direct relief exactly what investors and what the general kind of markets felt about the financial power of the Super League.
Yeah, I think that it's a good illustration of what I think everybody knew, which is that the Super League was going to be really good for the teams in the Super League and probably not that good for teams that weren't in the Super League, or at least some teams that weren't in the Super League. And I know that PR wise, they have to try to spin it, but like trying to sugarcoat the Super League as, good for all football everywhere was always quite the trick.
So we have some time left, obviously, but I want to prioritize what you guys think is important to talk about right now that we haven't talked about yet. I mean, I could do this for hours and ask you guys a million questions, but I also feel like, with respect to your time and the expertise that you have, what is it that we haven't talked about yet that that you feel is really important to discuss?
I think there is an interesting question related to why they rushed this out, because I'm pretty sure that they did rush it out. Because I simply don't believe that they were this unprepared. That is, if they had without rushing it out, you know what I'm saying? If they had the proper kind of run up, they would have been able to prepare, kind of, test the waters, begin to kind of open people's minds up to this, and then responded more appropriately to the backlash, potentially highlighted what they called the solidarity payments, maybe even tried to get the institutions on board, et cetera, et cetera. But they didn't. So why did they rush it out? What happened? And I don't know the answer to that. I wonder.
Doesn't it kind of feel like they were trying to beat the new UCL rules out? And I don't know why, but that's what it felt like to me. It felt like they were trying to beat those out because we were hearing rumors on both of them leading up. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, the Super League became solid. It was announced the day before the new UCL proposal. And I think somebody somewhere made the decision that they needed to beat that out in order to have a chance at having this happen. My gut, and I'm not a billionaire club owner, but my gut is they would have been better off after the UCL rules, because they could have said, look at that mess. Here's all the problems with that mess that the UCL wants to do. Here's all the extra games. We can't do it. We need something else. Here's something else, right? Yeah. Here's the Super League. And you have something, you have a foil, right? You have a way of making UEFA the people who moved first with a bad idea, and you coming in with a better idea. Instead, there was no debate, or very little debate or discussion about the UCL proposal at all. Everyone just kind of took it in stride because we were all busy, our hair on fire about the Super League.
It's a great point. I think, to your question, the answer to your question, Gabe, I think it ultimately does. It goes hand in hand with the announcement of the new Champions League format. And they wanted to beat UEFA to it. But for reasons Evan mentioned, I think it would have made sense if they didn't do it. And of all the things they didn't prepare for and weren't ready for, the one that shocked me the most was that they didn't even have the teams. They didn't. What was the plan? Because and Florentino also said, well, we haven't invited Bayern, Dortmund, and I don't know if it was PSG or Porto, who was the third team. That turned out to be not true as well, and they just declined. And there was documents leaked about that too. So I don't know what the plan was. Again, how were they supposed to fill this up? They didn't even have the teams to push ahead. So maybe they were just hoping that when they announced it, everyone will go, wow, all right, we want to be a part of it. We want to be part of that party. And it just didn't happen. It totally backfired. It's incredible.
Yeah.
We're going to have 15 founders. Here's the 12 founders.
Right. Yeah.
It's stunning. That particular one, that we had joked at the beginning. I joked with Ernesto, my buddy, who also does soccer and competition law, and he can't be on the show because it's possible his law firm will be representing one of the clubs in an inevitable lawsuit. And we were joking about how really what's going on, the reason that PSG wasn't signing on is because they saw the other signers and they were like, oh, maybe they'll all get kicked out of the Champions League and we'll win it by default.
PSG is the best example of how there's no heroes here, right? Because, they're owned by, the same entity that also has, massive contract for UCL television rights. So of course they weren't going to bolt. But if that wasn't the case, like, does anyone actually think that like a Qatari sovereign wealth fund is taking a principled stand on the proper structure of European football? Of course not.
Yeah.
And that sort of gets me to the other thing that I thought was like at least important to mention, which is going back to all the way back to the beginning. We really need to underscore that there's no one is a good actor here, and that I think the only really good actors are the fans who protested. I mean, we've said that they directly influence the government. It's also true that I'm sure the various governments, Macron said so in France as well as Johnson, and I believe the stuff said in Spain and Italy. They all saw how unpopular this was, and that, when you have something unpopular that lots of people are thinking about, you can capitalize it politically. But, I do think it's worth just underscoring for folks that everyone needs to be very, very kind of nuanced in how you talk about this, because we don't want to fall into a position where we're like, where FIFA is a good guy, where UEFA is a good guy, where even the teams that bolted right away are good. I mean, like, we don't want to be, applauding generally, folks, and we don't want to mythologize the Champions League either. There's tons of issues with that competition as well.
So one thing about the protest that kind of irked me, and I guess this is the point that I would raise as like something I want to keep in mind, and Matt, it goes with something I said earlier, which is that through the protest, there was this kind of undercurrent that like, this is the American invasion of European football, and this is American ideas ruining the sport. And that was killing me because some of these owners are European. Florentino Perez is not American. He was going to be the chairman of this thing and has been thinking, has plenty of powerful European people were involved in this and spearheaded it. And the reason I think that that's important to keep in mind is what I was saying earlier, which is two things. One is what Gabe was just saying, which is that it's important not to like valorize and mythologize the billionaires who didn't jump on the Super League, because they're different in interests more than principles. And the second is because I don't think that blaming American influence is helpful in conversations that we need to have about what the game should look like, even if it doesn't need to look like a Super League. Thinking that any outside ideas or any involvement by Americans in this process or any discussion by American fans, like I even saw on Twitter, people just like dunking on Americans having an opinion on the Super League. Like, get out of here with that. It's not helpful. It's not useful.
I agree. I there was a point like where I was trying to keep track of all the arguments for and against it, because everyone, it seemed like, there was the whole thing about we don't want this to be Americanized, and then there was the greed aspect, and then there's like, what about the small teams being part of this? What about the away trips to Stoke? So it was all kind of convoluted. Ultimately, like, some of those things obviously have merit, right? And certainly, like, I think one of the things was like in the Chelsea protest, there was one guy who held up a sign like, we still want to go to Stoke on a Wednesday night. And, the rebuttal to that from the 12 teams was, you're still going to get that. We want to be in the domestic leagues. But I think where it falls apart is that once you have the Super League, then the away trip to Stoke may be completely meaningless from a positional standpoint for the big team, who has no reason to, like, if they're out of the title race, they don't need to, they have a guaranteed spot. And so then the Champions League and the Super League, I don't think would have been able to coexist. I think it would have have to have been one or the other. And, we have an example of this in basketball where the NBA and ABA existed and the stars were kind of dispersed between the two, and ultimately one merged, and they merged and one ate the other. But the fan protests are interesting. Like, to be quite honest, I was blown away by the amount of, like, with everyone poking at this from different angles, the fans, Boris Johnson, FIFA, UEFA, all of the clubs who came out against it, the players, the coaches, all of this stuff. It became this thing where that surrounded this and just broke it down. And I would love to see that kind of energy in response to the racism that exists in the sport. Like, now that I know that this is possible, and I'm pleasantly surprised by that, let's use this to do it again with things that like are terrible. You know what I mean? That's what caught my eye.
Yeah.
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 UEFA and FIFA like mobilized, immense amount of resources against this, and it's like, okay, cool, man, but couldn't you do that with other things also? I mean, like, it's not like ending racism in football is somehow unpopular. Like, I would imagine it's almost like exactly as popular as fighting against the Super League. So yeah, totally agree.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. And it's not just UEFA and FIFA who famously don't give a shit and could. But I think it is right to, I guess, to put it most charitably, hopefully this will help fans recognize their own power to change things. And reaction to racism on the pitch doesn't just have to be the supporters trust putting out a statement.
Yeah.
It can be something more direct and impactful than that. It can be people showing up at a stadium. It can be people threatening not to buy tickets anymore. It can be stronger. And clubs, I'm not, there's no promise they're going to listen, but they listened here. It's one way or the other.
Yeah. And so just to like give a exclamation point on the American stuff, one of the best models for mobilizing and the success story of mobilizing fans actually happened here, and it happened here like 5 years ago when the owner of the Columbus Crew said he was going to relocate the team out of the state to another place and start a franchise using the Crew's infrastructure in Dallas, Texas. And the fans and the supporters groups at the Crew mobilized such a powerful movement that it convinced the governor of Ohio to bring suit against the guy under a kind of obscure Ohio provision that called the Modell Law that prevents franchises from relocating outside of the state without giving someone from the state a chance to buy the franchise. And it was successful. The Crew is still in Columbus. So, Americans have a long experience of mobilizing fans against bad monopolistic and bad corporate practices, right? Because we have this experience of teams that we love just completely being destroyed and moved somewhere else. And there's a lot, I think, that folks should, on both sides of the pond, should see in this, and really we should be in solidarity with each other rather than attacking each other.
So this is super interesting, and I'm glad you bring this up, and it leads me to a question I wanted to ask both of you. Going back to something that Tony Cruz said earlier this season, and also just your idea about mobilization and stuff, like what Jordan Henderson did, where he called all the captains in the Premier League together for an emergency meeting to combat this. I mean, imagine if we could do something like this to stand up against the human rights violations in Qatar, right? And Tony Cruz has kind of spoken a bit about this. He kind of tippy-toed around it before, but the idea that, like, look, it doesn't matter. We're puppets. We don't have a voice until a player union is formed. And I'm curious to know, do you guys think, how far away are we from a players union, and what are the obstacles to achieving something like that?
I love these ideas. I always feel like the players need to be represented better because the disparities are very bad between the top and the bottom level of compensation. And so what historically the players unions in the United States and other places have done is reduce the disparity in pay between the top paid players and the bottom paid players through collective bargaining negotiations. The problem is that the unionization would require a agreement across the big leagues. I think I'm not, it's not like Madrid or whoever could relocate out of the country if, say, the Spanish players unionized. But it would, in theory, make it less likely that people would want to play for Madrid if the CB, like collective bargaining, resulted in a salary cap structure where the top players could only be paid so much in order to allow the teams to in order to enforce the teams to pay the bottom players and the mid-level players more. And so I don't know. It's a tough one, and I would love it, but I think it would need to be a little bit, it would have to be very carefully done.
So ironically, the Super League probably would have made a players' union significantly easier, because what it would have done is segmented off a portion of the labor market into a different group, right? You would have Super League quality players. This is something, we talk about Champions League quality players right now, but a Champions League quality player might go to any of 40 teams because there's a lot of teams that have a reasonable chance of making the Champions League any given year. If it was going to be much reduced, right, and we're talking, cutting that in half, and 15 that are going to be there every year, now you've got a labor market that is captive, and that then the incentives change with respect to developing a players union. And so it might have made it a lot easier for, the reason Gabe said, you wouldn't have that threat of, well, I can just go to England, or I could just go to Germany and play. Like, what, you want to be in the Super League? You're going to have to play for a Super League founder to know you're going to be there. And so maybe that's tough to overcome. I do think that players do still have some power. Probably not your mid-tier or your lower level players, but your, top end guys, let's say they were going to say, we're not going to play for PSG because of Qatari human rights violations. It's a big deal, right?
Yeah.
You get guys on board and say they're not going to play. You're not going to get all of them, but if you get some people together and say we're not going to do it, that's a statement. It doesn't require a union that I can think of. It would just be a kind of we're going to sign somewhere else. So there's things that can be done. That's more in line with what you were talking about, Jordan Henderson kind of getting the captains together, getting important players together, and getting on the same page about where they stand on something.
Yeah.
See, like that, I mean, that's a great message. They should have really thought about the PR and probably hired you guys for the PR instead. Like, to come out and say, hey, this would have created a players union. We give the players a voice. Instead, no, we don't tell anybody. And then we go on El Chiringuito and we screw it all up. It was a disaster. I mean, everything, it just wasn't thought out. We're approaching game time, so I think we got to wrap it up here. It's been a pleasure, gentlemen. It was awesome having you guys on the show. Thank you for your insight. I mean, I really hope it doesn't, for the future, I hope it's not something like this that brings you guys out. It's nice to have you guys on, and you're welcome anytime. So thank you for joining the show. I really appreciate it.
Awesome.
Yeah, thanks for
absolutely
having me.
Ecstatic to be back. Much love, my man.
And everyone stick around for part 2 post-game show coming right up.